to another episode of the podcast Resilient Revival, where we explore the often unseen and overlooked aspects of our society. In this episode, we continue delving into the compelling topic of the living conditions in the abandoned buildings, shining a light on the unintended consequences that often arise from applying the creative and entrepreneurial thinking to the problem of abandoned buildings, particularly when redeveloping or revitalizing the buildings. We further discuss some of the strategies that have been implemented in addressing this issue. Nomzamo Zondo continues to provide us with the valuable insights into understanding this issue. We welcome you again, Nomzamo. What are the implications or the consequences of the property developers, the city, exercising the entrepreneurial mind or trying to make business out of the abandoned buildings? What are some of the consequences? What happens if they do that?
Look, I mean, it's displacement, right? It's displacement. And so, for instance, you can look at Maboneng and what happened with Maboneng and how it displaced a lot of people who used to live in that area of Joburg. The one thing about the inner city as a housing option for many people is that, one, it's close to livelihood opportunities. In a situation like ours where very few people are permanently employed, so many people who are unemployed try and find means to make a life for themselves. So the inner city keeps them close to those opportunities. For those who are employed, who are categorized as the working poor, the inner city is a place where they are able to connect. So if you work in Sandton, you're one taxi away from Sandton. If you work in Bryanston, you're one taxi away from Bryanston, as opposed to being maybe 2 or 3 taxis away. But also, the one thing is that also because of informal trade, there's a feeling that, yes, the inner city is hard and you can struggle, but also you can be able to get something to sleep, to eat, to sleep that night, support your children. And if, for instance, we were to allow the entrepreneurial spirit to be the guide of what happens to the inner city, then all of that would die. Many academics speak about the social value of land, the social value of property. That social value would mean nothing because, in effect, all you would prioritize is the fact that someone has money. And I think for the city, always the argument is when property owners take over the building, that there'll be revenue. But there'll be revenue to do what? And as I've said again, it's historically important for South Africa. We're not a country of equal opportunities. In effect, when the city allows the entrepreneurial spirit to be what guides it and propels it, then what it does actually it supports discrimination. It ensures that special apartheid, special segregation continues, with black poor people being pushed out into the margins, and the center and the core being preserved for those with money. And that's not something, I mean, some of us are comfortable with allowing to see, which means that then we are kind of at times placed in an adversarial position to the state. But for us, our guide is the Constitution, which says we must address the injustices of our past. It is the same Constitution which puts forward a vision that says the lives of people living in South Africa, the quality of their lives will be improved on a daily basis. And for us, we feel that the city should not be putting us in a place where we are going back on the fulfillment of rights instead of going forward. And if we were going forward, then we'd be saying, okay, here are this group of people who are unlawful occupiers, who have no secure tenure, who don't have the right to property because of the historical context. And what we want to do is we want to push them a little bit further. So they don't have secure tenure today. they don't have access to basic services. Here we'll address the issue of services. Here we'll think of ways how to address the issue of tenure. We'll think of ways of moving them forward on a daily basis. And also creating an environment where people are not just unlawful. I feel like even the fact that people are unlawful occupiers is something that undermines their dignity. It undermines their claim as people who live in South Africa. And I feel that the state, both the local state and the provincial and national, should be doing something to make sure that actually living in South Africa means that you can actually live lawfully. And there should be a collaboration between national government, provincial government, and local government to make sure that there's a way to meet that need. And we're not there because, unfortunately, everybody's chasing revenue, chasing money, and then the private developers on the other side are chasing their bottom line. And because the inner city is such a contested space, the entrepreneurial spirit is not going to end. In fact, I think the rental rates in the inner city are comparable to those of Sandton in terms of how much you rent per meter square, because people want to be close to livelihood opportunities, to many options. I need to take this call.
Okay, from our conversation, we are getting that it is evident that the conditions in the buildings are extremely difficult. And so the question to you as an organization that is dedicated to advocating for the socio-economic rights and advocating for the marginalized communities, have you guys been in any way involved in helping address the people that living in the buildings are challenged or are faced with?
Yeah, so I think our work, at SERI, our work is arranged. We use 3 methodologies. So we use litigation, research, and advocacy. And in those, for instance, in our advocacy work, one of the key things that we've worked on is to create a sense of community in the communities that we are working in, and supporting those who are involved in leading those communities. Because if the community is not organized, it's then difficult for them to address some of these challenges. So as I'm saying, if they can come together and agree, for instance, how they make sure that the gate is locked, people don't run in at night, then they're gonna struggle with the problem of criminals trying to use their building as a hideout spot. Similarly, if they have a challenge of not having water, and they need to engage the municipality, need to collect money, for instance, to contribute towards basic services, without a leadership in the committee, and even for that committee which leads the building, without the support of other people in the inner city who've gone through the challenges that they're facing, it would be difficult for them to work that out. So we've in our work worked alongside the Inner City Federation in the Inner City Resource Center, which are both organizations that organize buildings that are unlawfully occupied in order to find solutions for the challenges that they're facing. In our work, we have, I think, produced research reports that engage how the national state should be supporting municipalities in order to provide alternative accommodation, what should be happening in relation to the emergency housing program and the financing of that program in order for the municipalities to have funds to address these problems and address these communities. And of course, through our litigation support, we've managed to stop the eviction of tens of thousands of people from the inner city of Johannesburg. And I think, but throughout all of this, I think our involvement has been about bringing to the table residents and the city and other housing practitioners, urban planners like yourself, people who are involved in architecture, who could help us navigate the failing infrastructure, and trying to bring those people together in order to address issues of basic services. For instance, during COVID, we actually formed a task team with the City of Johannesburg, Plan Act, One-to-One, the Inner City Federation, and the Inner City Resource Center. And we're trying to engage around the provision of basic services to communities to address the COVID pandemic, but also knowing that it's a permanent need for people living in the inner city. So that's really been our involvement. I think at the core, I think of the challenge that we're facing is that there is this understanding that if you don't have money, you can't have a say about where you live. And we believe that everyone living in South Africa should be able to exercise their agency to live where they would prefer. And we believe that the state is empowered, right? And it is obligated, in fact, to make that possible. And to make it possible not just by providing housing opportunities in the inner city, but also, what's the word? Legislating and managing private developers. So instead of them seeing themselves as the pipeline to provide buildings to quench the entrepreneurial spirit of private developers, we feel that they should be legislating, for instance, to make sure that there are affordable housing opportunities that are not only coming out of them as the state, but also private property owners. So I think we have, the City of Joburg did adopt an inclusionary housing policy a few years ago. And they, of course, one of the questions would be, how effective has that inclusionary housing policy been? Is it being enforced? Because if it was being enforced, then at least would be having a lot more housing options being provided to people. I think one of the things was what people don't understand is that people think that people live in unlawful buildings because they live there for free. But there is a cost to living in unlawful occupation. And there is not just a cost of not having your peace of mind, but there is a financial cost. The first financial cost is that if you don't have electricity, you buy paraffin, you buy gas. If you don't have water, then you must purchase water, you must give a thank you to the security guard next door to be able to access their water. When your children, if you don't have electricity, when the children need lighting at night, there's a cost. And that cost, which now leaves people's pockets and goes to different places, could be going to a state provided accommodation, or could be going to that private accommodation, privately developed accommodation that is specifically for people of that income bracket. And unfortunately, we haven't really been able to get people to get buy-in around, let's put together a strategy to say that the inner city is for everyone. We understand the city had the strategy of the corridors of freedom, but freedom doesn't say you must live only in corridors. You must be able to live in the center if that's what you want. And at the very least, what freedom should guarantee us is that we shouldn't be removed and plucked out of the center into the corridors or into the margins.
And also because they are there just to access the opportunities. It's not really, And also there's been like the strategy, the bed building strategy or program that was meant to convert the abandoned buildings to make them affordable rentals and all that, to address the housing backlog and all of that.
That was the goal, but the problem is that they saw buildings, they didn't see people, so there was no planning in the project to say we have, let's say, 50 abandoned buildings, but we also have, let's say, 20,000 people live in them. You can see the buildings, but for as long as there's 20,000 people living in them, you can't renovate them. But if you have a plan to say, we have these 20 buildings, we have this many people, this is how we're going to decant them, this is how we're going to renovate, this is how we will make sure that they're able to live, in the future. Without that, all those plans are worthless.
Okay. What do you think, having seen all the challenges and all of the things that are facing, what do you think are the solution or the potential solutions or interventions that could help improve maybe the living conditions of the individuals or the way the city addresses those people and all of that? And also if you know maybe the strategies or the successful examples that have been implemented after that.
Sure. So I think the city of Johannesburg and the state more generally needs to have a political will to address the problem of unlawful occupation. That's the first part. And maybe before I move to what would happen if that political will existed, I want to give you an example of one building. It's in the Bertrand's Priority block, close to the stadium. And in that building is a building called Josana Court. The residents in that building were being evicted by the city. That the eviction application, I think, has been ongoing for 15 years, but has been dormant for the last 9 to 10 years. And those residents came together to one, in the building, as I said, there was a problem of failing infrastructure. They didn't have water, the sanitation didn't work because there were no pipes. They had a problem of waterproofing, so water was coming into their rooms. And the residents came together, and together, they collected money to put in the pipes. They worked with the Inner City Resource Center. They work with one-to-one agency for engagement, even to seek funds and get sponsors to address the issues of sanitation, the issues of waterproofing. And they've accomplished all of that. In fact, the building looks better today than it did in 2013 when the city was still pursuing the eviction, because the community came together to resolve the problems that they had in the building around access to basic services. And that's what the community could do without the political will. What would happen if there was political will? The first thing is, I would say, you would have a map within the city of Johannesburg, or just take the inner city and say, these are all the buildings that are unlawfully occupied in the inner city. You would check how many have access to basic services, what basic services do they have. If there are those they don't have, what's the problem? Is it a problem of infrastructure? Is the problem because they've just simply been disconnected? And the city would find ways to make sure those communities have access to basic services. The one thing I didn't even mention earlier is that just when a building doesn't have water, there's a smell that comes from a building not having water. Just an everyday thing. But the moment that you put water into the building, already it changes even the air around it. Once you've planned that out and you say, okay, everyone now has access to basic services, you then go into the issue of who owns the building, what can be done. And so one of the things that we've been engaging government about, I'm sure you've heard in the last few years, there's been a lot of talk around expropriation without compensation. And we're saying, let the state use expropriation. We're not even saying without compensation, use expropriation to make sure that they bridge the gap. Address the issue of ownership, address the issue of unlawful occupation by expropriating these buildings, giving the residents secure tenure. And then even, I feel like if you did this, if you would go back to the bed buildings project, is that what you would then be able to do? Is you'd be able to say, actually, in this building, we've now renovated it in a way that we can accommodate 1.5 more people than it did before, and therefore you are able to make other buildings accessible to renovate completely, maybe for affordable rental. Or one of the problems, I'm not even sure if you knew this, but one of the things that's been happening now is that NSFAS and is one of the cash cows for private developers. So in effect, people who are buying these buildings are buying them so they can accommodate students. And again, if the city was coordinating between the national government, and local government, then these buildings could be accessible for use by students at rents that are affordable to what, instead of NASFAS as a fund being drained, the livelihood opportunities. In a situation like ours where very few people are permanently employed, so many people who are unemployed try and find means to make a life for themselves. So the inner city keeps them close to those opportunities. For those who are employed, who are categorized as the working poor, the inner city is a place where they are able to connect. So if you work in Sandton, you're one taxi away from Sandton. If you work in Bryanston, you're one taxi away from Bryanston, as opposed to being maybe 2 or 3 taxis away. But also, the one thing is that also because of informal trade, there's a feeling that yes, the inner city is hard and you can struggle, but also you can be able to get something to sleep, to eat, to sleep that night, support your children. And if, for instance, we were to allow the entrepreneurial spirit to be the guide of what happens to the inner city, then all of that would die. The many academics speak about the social value of land, the social value of property. That social value would mean nothing because in effect all you would prioritize is the fact that someone has money. And I think for the city always the argument is when property owners take over the building that there'll be revenue. But there'll be revenue to do what? And as I've said again, it's historically important for South Africa. We're not a country of equal opportunities. In effect, when the city allows the entrepreneurial spirit to be what guides it and propels it, then what it does actually it supports discrimination. It ensures that special apartheid, special segregation continues, with black poor people being pushed out into the margins, and the center and the core being preserved for those with money. And that's not something some of us are comfortable with allowing to see, which means that then we are kind of at times placed in an adversarial position to the state. But for us, our guide is the Constitution, which says we must address the injustices of our past. It is the same Constitution which puts forward a vision that says the lives of people living in South Africa, the quality of their lives will be improved on a daily basis. And for us, we feel that the city should not be putting us in a place where we are going back on the fulfillment of rights instead of going forward. And if we were going forward, then we'd be saying, okay, here are this group of people who are unlawful occupiers, who have no secure tenure, who don't have the right to property because of the historical context. And what we want to do is we want to push them a little bit further. So they don't have secure tenure today. They don't have access to basic services. Here we'll address the issue of services. Here we'll think of ways how to address the issue of tenure. We'll think of ways of moving them forward on a daily basis. And also creating an environment where people are not just unlawful. I feel like even the fact that people are unlawful occupiers is something that undermines their dignity. It undermines their claim as people who live in South Africa.
Apologies for cutting you off there, but I have to end this episode. Thank you so much for joining us, and we're looking forward to hearing from you on our next episode.